Hello and welcome to the next part of my video lecture series on Chapter 3 for our server virtualization course. As usual, I'm talking through the slide decks related to this book, Hands-on Computer Virtual Computing, 2nd edition. It's not too late to get yourself the Dead Tree edition. You don't have to because the text is in MindTap, but you will lose it at the end of your Cengage license period. Anyhow, in the previous video, I talked about the menu toolbar. We're going to talk about some other assorted things, working with virtual machines, starting them, stopping them, dealing with hardware options, and this is over the course of the next several videos. This is not all this video. We're kind of dealing with, you can almost call it the miscellany of working with VMware Workstation. So let's get started. So, talking about working with virtual machines, we're going to talk about stopping and starting them, configuring virtual hardware devices with specifically virtual devices, specifically virtual hardware. I've talked about some of this already and covered some of it in class when I demoed, when I walked and talked through the GUI a little bit, I think. We're going to talk about installing and working with guest OSs. You should actually be somewhat familiar with that already, particularly if you used VMware Workstation in a previous course. If not, you're going to get good and familiar with it here. And we're going to talk about things like snapshots and cloning, and the Unity view. So let's get started. Of course, the first thing we have to do after we've built the VM and installed the guest OS, we have to start it and stop it. And there's a couple different ways to do this. You can start the VM either using the VM menu or the start button from the toolbar or the virtual machine tab. As usual, there's more than one way to get the job done. Your VM menu will allow you to start up the guest or power on to firmware, as in power on but only goes far as the BIOS. So you don't have to try to interrupt it. Now, this third option is useful because the hypervisor will hide its virtual BIOS from you unless you tell it to expose it in some way. There are things you can do to make VMware show you the BIOS. There's a value you can add to a VMX file. You can also do this by, in an ESXi host, you can actually add a new configuration key, as it were, and give it a name and give it an appropriate value. I think the key, and I think I've actually done a video about this. I'll make sure that I have. If not, I will re-demonstrate it, and I might actually have to demonstrate it once we start talking about ESXi as well. Now you wouldn't do this on the ESXi host itself. You would do it inside ESXi for specific VMs. In any case, you can start it up and just let the thing boot. You can power it up. You can power it up to firmware. In order to power on a number of VMs at the same time, you can put them all in a library, start them all at once. Remember, as I said, you can't do more than that. You can't reset them all. You can't suspend them all. You can't reboot them all. You can power them all up at the same time, which might be useful if you have to have a whole bunch of things that should come up at the same time. If, on the other hand, you have things that need to come up in a certain order, say, for example, you've got, say, let's imagine an Active Directory domain. So you've got your domain controller. And say, for example, you've got a standalone DNS, you bring it up. You've got a standalone DHCP, bring it up. Say if it's Active Directory integrated DNS, the domain controller is doing a lot of that. Or say, for example, you've also got all of that. You've got your backup DNS, your backup DHCP, and you have a backup domain controller. You would obviously want to bring up the domain controller, what used to be called the primary domain controller, then bring up the backup, then bring up DNS, then bring up DHCP, then bring up your hosts. If you put all of your Active Directory servers and clients and all of it in the same bucket, and you don't make an effort to control the order in which they come up, you might generate a race condition, which is a race condition is what happens when one process is waiting on another inside an information system. Um, Now, to shut down a guest, the best possible thing, as I've said before and will say again, is to let the guest OS do its job. Um, Most modern operating systems want to shut themselves down, and in a certain way. They have services to shut down, daemons to stop, um, file handles to close, memory to deallocate, etc., etc., etc. TCP sessions to close if you're dealing with something that's on a network. Um, it has got a lot of things to do, and it should be allowed to do them for itself. Um, Now, so you can perform a normal shutdown from the guest OS. That is your best option, particularly for server OSs, like say Windows Server 2012, 2016, 2019. It's going to want it to tell you to tell it why it's shutting down, because that information may become very useful to an admin down the line. Now, if that doesn't work, say for example you try to shut it down and it hangs. Then you can use the shutdown guest option from one of those power menus, or right-click it and choose shutdown. This would be equivalent to walking up to the machine, grabbing the uh, the power cable that's plugged into the um, um, power supply and pulling. Not always a good idea. Now, when you do this, you'll see something. If say, for example, if you're in a VM tab, or you close the administrative console while the VMs are running, you'll see this. It'll give you an option. You can suspend it. You can run it in the background. You can power it off. You can change your mind. If you don't really mean to close the whole thing down, you say you were trying to close a different tab, a different VM, and you accidentally clicked the wrong thing, you can click cancel and save your work. Or you can suspend it if you need it to come back to a certain state, but you really have to walk away. Say, for example, you're working in one place and you need to pick up and go to another place. And the time you have to pick up and get gone faster, then you can shut all those things down gracefully. It is acceptable to suspend everything. You can completely close VMware Workstation and then close the laptop, put it in your bag, walk away. That'll be fine. You could run it in the background, but VMware is going to keep it alive. Now, the thing to note here, and I know I say that a lot, VMware these days has a couple of services that run all the time. So even if you think VMware is not running, there's a VMware service running on at least on a Windows computer. So the third option is you can power it off. Say, for example, you've tried to shut it down correctly, and it won't. And you don't think suspending it will be a good idea, and you don't think that running in the background can be a good idea, you just shut it off. Basically, the hypervisor will say, you're done. It'll break the file locks and whatnot. Now, you may have to do some corrective maintenance when you come back to it. Let check disk run, let fs check run, whatnot. Hope that your BCD is not corrupted if it's a Windows 10 machine or Windows NT box. In any case, so these are your options. In the next video, I will talk about your hardware options. Thank you for watching.